in the chat, just type up your names and your speaker positions, just so we can copy it into the ballots at the end as well. Okay, and yeah, thank you. And also indicating reply, I can see you've done that there, England. Okay, anyway, so now that I'll leave you guys to do that, let's have the first speaker from the proposition here.
Can I just check that the audio is okay? Great. When 1,000 people suffocated in the collapsed Rana Plaza factory, the world watched for a week. People watched, but nothing happened. Rana Plaza made fabrics which were sold on to Primark. The problem is that companies like Primark claimed there was nothing to do with them. It was in their supply chain. Rana Plaza collapsing, starvation wages, suicide nets in Apple's Chinese factories. Companies claim that they have no control over these things. What we tell you is Primark had control over Rana Plaza. Primark should have been prosecuted. Primark should have been fined. That is what we stand for on side proposition. Given that, 4 arguments from our side. Firstly, why are these MNCs liable for human rights abuses in their supply chain? Secondly, why can we successfully prosecute these MNCs? Thirdly, why does this limit human rights abuses? And fourthly, our second speech is going to look at why this creates an organic desire for improved regulation within these countries. Before that, a 4-point model. Firstly, we think these companies can be held liable with the massive attendant fines that come along with it in any civil court in any country where they have any operation. Amazon can be prosecuted in America in any single country where it has operations. Secondly, we anticipate and we encourage international institutions like ASEAN, like the EU, to hold them liable, like the EU did when it prosecuted Apple for tax evasion in Ireland. Thirdly, we think the money that comes from these fines should come from those who were abused. And fourthly, we think given that these are civil cases, lawyers can claim legal fees if they bring these on the behalf of the abused and can charge legal fees from the companies in these cases. We concede sometimes these companies might not even know these abuses exist. What we tell you is that that was negligence, that they profited from those abuses, that they turned a blind eye, and that they should be prosecuted as a result. Given that, why are they liable to these abuses? We're going to give you 5 reasons. Firstly, we think they pay, fund, and facilitate this abuse. They demand the lowest cost from the people. Apply them. They hold them over the barrel. As we move away, if you do not give us $10,000 less on this supply, and they turn a blind eye when they use abuses in order to achieve those lower costs. They actively encourage and pay for these abuses. But secondly, let's note these companies have the power to intervene. We are talking about some of the most powerful, some of the most wide-reaching, some of the wealthiest companies in the world. They could pay everyone the minimum wage, only increase the cost of their jeans by £1. No, thank you. We think it's frankly ridiculous to believe that a company like Apple could not solve problems in their supply chain. But thirdly, and the rest of this, we're going to take them at their absolute best. And let's note, we think Apple probably do know about suicide nets in their factories when it was on every single national newspaper in the world. But let's assume that they didn't know. Why are they still liable? Because it is downright negligent. They could have solved this. And let's note, when financial institutions deal in stolen money, which they didn't know about, they are still liable for that because it recognizes they had a duty to know the people they are working with. We think MNCs equally have a duty to know who they are working with. But fourthly, they directly profited from it. Even if they didn't know about the abuses lowered their costs and lined their pockets. The reason that Jeff Bezos can afford his space vanity project is because he is paying workers in India starvation wages. They have profited from that. They should pay the fines that come along with that. But fifthly, These companies have caused supply chains to look like this. They have caused a dangerous race to the bottom, which has pitted countries against each other, which has forced down prices and forced up abuses. We think this is the fault of multinational corporations. They have gained from it, they should pay the price of it. And let's note, this stands in and of itself. Opposition need to show why multinational companies are not liable for this, why they shouldn't be able to be prosecuted for this to get anywhere in this debate. Why can we get successful prosecutions? But firstly, I'll take a POI if you have one.
Don't you think that because of the proportionality of human abuses, for example, a child labor in Bangladesh is considered okay, a lot of losses because of your fines on these companies will cause a loss of quality for these MNCs?
We agree these companies might suffer as a result of this. We agree they might clean up human rights abuses. We agree they might have to stop child labor. But those are things we are willing to do because child labor is only necessary when their parents are forced into it because the very same company is paying them next to nothing. Why can we get successful prosecutions? Firstly, we think whistleblowers come forward onto our side. Why is that? Because there is a concrete outcome of it. You can be in a lawsuit, you can contact a law firm who will represent you, you can contact an institution, you will get money as a result. Let's compare this to the status quo, where essentially you are reliant on it being picked up in a 24 hours news cycle, and in reality, getting laid off by your company anyway because you blew the whistle. We give them a direct incentive to come forward and talk about this to get the money that they deserve. And also, let's note that civil lawsuits have a 50-50 balance of proof, and we are doing this in every country. This allows more successful prosecutions. I think secondly, lawyers, and the best lawyers in the world, will do this for profit. They will do this to increase their prestige. And given that multinational corporations will likely spend millions on legal fees, we think these lawyers can claim that as well and make a big profit from this as well. And thirdly, we think institutions like the EU have shown that this can be successful. The problem in this debate isn't that people don't know that multinational corporations are committing abuses. Everyone knows that. The comparative on their side is all they have is boycotts. And we get more information and attention when we have lawsuits. And we have prosecuting within those countries where there simply isn't the same robust regulatory framework we get when we have an international jurisdiction. So how do we change the incentives and reduce human rights abuses? Firstly, we change financial incentives. It is cheaper to raise wages at your factory than it is to fight a lengthy court battle and pay out the fine of those wages anyway. We think secondly, legal proceedings draw attention, lawyers dig into the detail, they get the information that causes the boycott to happen. The impacts of this. Firstly, no more abusive subcontractors. The subcontractors themselves have an incentive to clean up. Secondly, the companies pay more to their subcontractors in the knowledge that they will not commit human rights abuses. And thirdly, we think these companies will send people into the factories to ensure that human rights abuses are not happening in the first place. They will ask the age of the workers. They will ask how much they are being paid today. At the end of this debate, the choice is clear. Continue to turn a blind eye and rely on these MNCs self-policing, like happened in Rana Plaza, or face the issue, prosecute the issue, reduce the issue. That is what we do on side proposition. I'm very proud to propose.
All right, we thank that speaker for their speech and would like to call on the first speaker from the opposition, here.
All right, let me just set my timer and can I be heard? Can I be seen? Great. So my speech will start in 3, 2, 1. I think that panel, look at what Team England mischaracterized in today's debate. They mischaracterize on what are these abuses and what are the structural reasons that these abuses exist. See, in England, the thing that is just so simple to pressure an MNC and a supply chain and change the opinion of millions of Bangladesh workers, Indians, child labor, who they literally take their income from. Three things in my speech. Firstly, a framework in refuting theirs, and secondly, some responses to their case and their argument. Thirdly, my substantive. So firstly, on their framework. Now look, from the beginning of today's debate, we see this American's characterization, and I'll elaborate more on it. These abuses panel are actually, looks like child labor. But the problem is that they do not tell us the exclusivity of it. It is seen as a source of income in countries like Bangladesh, in countries like South Sudan, for instance, but it is seen in America as just human rights abuses. I think this must be noted because on their model, which we said, finding these companies, because you cannot change the ideas of South Sudanese workers. When you have a lot of these losses for these companies, you'll have less quality of products, which their first speaker literally agreed with us. I tell you that the low quality of products for these children means starvation. Why is this true? We tell you because the supply is going to be reduced because the profit is reduced. These children are going to not only get less quality of products. I tell you that the impact on our side of the house that these children value the quality of products more. So they agreed with this point, they cannot move forward. Secondly, they tell you these international organizations not sure what these are about, how exactly would they work, what exact laws, and by the way, they never even mentioned that again. Thirdly, MNCs are based in many locations and they are subject to laws. Proposition failed to engage with that. For example, Adidas using child labor in Bangladesh, but also never doing it in Canada because there are certain laws in Canada that they have to adhere to. But in Bangladesh, the government is the one responsible. This brings me to my fourth point, to this burden. Our burden today's debate is to show you that it is illegitimate to hold these MNCs reliable and that local laws are the ones that should hold reliable government, etc. Our arguments are two. First, I'm going to explain to you why blaming MNCs won't work, and secondly, my second speaker will tell you the backlash and the harms of blaming them, and even if arguing. Second thing in my speech is the response to what they've said. So they've said very exclusively, they said that MNCs are very bad and abusive. Firstly, look, this is a very extreme case. I tell you that Amazon in America, when there's a pressure on the government to implement better gender equality laws, Amazon will actually adhere. We tell you that the source of the problem is the government and is its laws. And actually, on our side of the house, which brings my second response, even if you do not bring you anything, on our side of the house, when we pressure these governments, notice all MNCs will adhere. On their side of the house, they only say, oh, I will just pressure a supply chain. Tell you all supply chains in that particular country, when you pressure the government, will adhere regarding this MNC, regarding Amazon or Whole Foods, whatever it is, they will adhere, which is exclusive to our side. Now I want to move on to my first argument, which I'm going to show you why blaming MNCs will not work. This argument is going to prove to you that the inability to do so by MNCs and some backlashes that might happen to the company. So first, what are these laws regarding human rights abuses? I told you, panel, they failed to engage with the proportionality of human rights abuses. I told you, I asked them in a POI that they actually agreed with this, that it is proportionally different and that these companies will actually face this. Since two things in this scenario is, firstly, rich and poor countries, and secondly, they are culturally different. So the impact of this is there are very different laws very different laws, and this is actually important because, for example, in Bangladesh, most impoverished families consider sending kids to work is actually legitimate. Yes, this is wrong. I do not consider this as a good thing. As we do not opposition, we do not consider this as a good thing. But we need to notice two things. Firstly, the needs of a country need these children to work. We're not justifying this, but we're just telling you this is the perspective of that country. Secondly, the parents' expectation, which actually is a legitimate way to explain these expectation between, like, what would an American father expect of his children? Well, it's very different from what a Sudanese father expects for his child. This is a point where they fail to engage with us. That is to say, notice that we're not giving justification for this to happen. We're against us totally, but we tell you there's a deep problem like poverty, like cultural issues. The impact of this a different perspective, bring you abuses, bring you different stakeholders that need to be punished. Now, secondly, I tell you, how does this previous point fall in today's debate? Their side of the house, we tell you that holding the MNCs accountable, liable for these abuses, i.e. compelling them, for example, to try and solve this gender imbalance in their company, for instance, we tell you it won't work for two main reasons. Firstly, there's an inability to do so. What does this mean? Because of the current circumstances in that country. For example, in India's southern side, most women are not allowed to be something other than homekeepers. The impact, or like the analysis that I'm making here, is that yes, it is wrong, but there is a cultural problem, and if the MNCs is held reliable, they cannot change this. Otherwise, they would have to just cut on men labor. They wouldn't get a lot of women because there's just women there that are not allowed to work. Won't solve any problem on their side, so I don't see why it's exclusive. Secondly, even if they change the current. Give this companies the incentive to do so. There are some laws, MNCs would be penalized if they change anything in their rules. For instance, in countries like Libya, mostly like northern African countries, Libya, Algeria, MNCs are not allowed to change anything of their policies because they are signing an agreement. That actually goes against their giving incentive to these MNCs. The impact of this is that not solving problem and causing more issues with supply and changing these laws. Before I move on, I'll see what they have.
If a driver is speeding and they hit a child, are they not responsible for that child's death because they did not see it?
I'm not getting the comparative that you're trying to make. Actually, I tell you that if the MNCs is doing this child labor in their company, they cannot cut on child labor because, as I said before, the analysis is that child labor is a crucial problem to the laws that exist in this country, to the cultural problems that exist in this country. Not sure what they're talking about. What changes on our side of the house is two things. Firstly, pressuring the government, because when you are pressuring the government, you're holding it accountable. For example, in Minnesota, in America, where you think that gender imbalance is perfect, there was a gender imbalance in Whole Foods. But we tell you that because Whole Foods, there was laws requiring Whole Foods to do this selection process that's 50% men, 50% women. They adhere to it. They're not as abusive, as bad as a proposition tries to push on us. Yes, they did adhere to it. But secondly, I tell you, even if we do not bring you anything in today's debate, well, we still tell you the crucial decision makers that are reliable to change the status quo. Actually, this is exclusive to our side of the house. So I think we give you an impact to this, that we can pressure the government in these MNCs. Governments should do these rules first, but then MNCs will follow, so it's more likely to change. Finally, why do you think this argument should be taken in today's debate? Panel, because we proved to you that the status quo has roots, that has problem in the roots of poverty and corruptional issues, shackled by these ideas in these states that MNCs can never change. Told you who is really accountable, told you the real decision maker. We proved to you the inconsistency of MNCs being held reliable by these local laws. I beg you to oppose.
All right, the House thanks that speaker for their speech and calls on the second speaker of the proposition, hear.
Can everyone hear me? Good to start. Panel, when Starbucks, a company worth billions of dollars, pays and facilitates the young children in Mexico to spend hours each day picking the coffee beans that made the Starbucks CEOs their billions, Starbucks is in the wrong. And regardless of the impact, we have a duty on side proposition that we believe it is principally necessary that Starbucks is held liable for that wrong. I'm going to do three things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to deal with the engagement we heard with Joe's speech and looking at the material that mostly clashed with that. Secondly, I'm going to do some extraneous rebuttal that they brought, to points they brought. And thirdly, I'm going to explain why this raises legal protections for workers in developing countries that helps everyone in that country, not just those working for MNCs. So what did Joe tell? Joe brought you a principle as to why we have to hold these companies liable. He told you that they pay, fund, and facilitate these human rights abuses, that they have the power to intervene because they're literally worth trillions, that this is an act of negligence when they don't know what's going on, and that they profit from those abuses and should return the pounds they took from the workers earning less than minimum wage. We also tell you that they caused this race to the bottom in the first place by incentivizing subcontractors to have worse conditions as possible in order to line their pockets. What responses did we hear to the principle? We heard no rebuttal towards the mechanisms that Joe brought you panel, which we think in and of itself means we should win the debate on that principle. All we heard is an idea of moral relativity. We are told that they already held to national laws, but we tell you that often the problem is that the legal systems in those countries don't work and cannot hold these companies liable. Because Bangladesh couldn't hold Primark liable because Bangladesh neither had the legal system nor did they have the power to stand up to a company that was literally bigger than them. When MNCs are often much larger, much more powerful and funding most of the income of these countries, there is no way for national laws to hold them accountable. Secondly, we were taught about the importance of moral relativity, how in some countries it is acceptable for children to go to work, in other countries it is not. Three things on this. Firstly, we think it is rare that the cultural problem or moral relativity is actually related to human rights abuses. We think in the majority of cases, things like having unsafe machines is not a moral necessity within a country. These are things that everyone can agree to and everyone thinks are okay. And that's why we think many countries across the world had signed up to the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Secondly, we think that things where it is maybe considered more acceptable, such as the case of child labour, comes out of necessity. It comes out of the fact that most people in that family aren't being paid a minimum wage. Most people in that family have terrible conditions, so they have to send their child to work. If we can make sure the child's mother gets a minimum wage, then we think those opinions change. Thirdly, we reject this idea of moral relativity. We think it is objectively wrong that there are suicide nets in Apple's factories in China. It is objectively wrong that the Rana Plaza building collapsed panel, and they have to prove otherwise. Secondly, what did Joe bring you? He told you why you can prosecute these cases on our side, much more than any cases on their side. Because whistleblowers have incentives to come out when actions actually happen. Because you have a lower burden of proof of civil cases. When robust judicial systems can prosecute these massive powers, and when the incentives of institutions and lawyers change. Panel, they conceded this material in the fact they gave no response and only gave examples of why the impacts were wrong. Thirdly, what did Joe tell you? He tells you that this ultimately therefore means you can improve human rights abuses because you have more information, more successful prosecutions, and massive changes in the financial incentives for everyone involved, from the law when Starbucks is hiring their workers. What responses did we hear? We heard MNCs can't change their practices because they are bound by the laws and contracts of their countries. We were genuinely quite confused about this panel because I think it's quite rare that a law says you must have unsafe machines, you must pay your worker not that much money. We think often laws allow people to have unsafe machines and pay their workers little money, but we don't think they enforce them, we don't think they necessitate them. What else did we hear on extraneous rebuttal that didn't clash with Joe's material? We heard firstly that you get worse products. Look, we're happy to concede products might get more expensive. We're happy for the consumer in America to pay a little bit more so that someone in the country making their clothes can feed their child. Look, we still think there's competition for good products. Probably what happens is these companies are willing to concede lower profits. Second thing we heard is that it harms the workers in these countries when child workers, when MNCs no longer hire them. Notice we think this is something that excludes the factor of child workers, and I've already dealt with that. Before I go on to my substantive, I'll take your POI. Yes.
If these companies were such as big as you're trying to say, and as you said, no country will hold them accountable, then who would do and how would you change this on your side of the house?
Look, I think Joe was very clear from the start of his model that any country in which this MNC is operating, any individual in that company, any country, any lawyer in that country, any big group such as the EU is able to prosecute these MNCs. We don't think it's likely that Apple's going to move out of the US or Europe. We don't think it's likely that Starbucks is going to move out of the US and Europe. We think you're going to be able to prosecute them. This is why we uniquely win this on our side, because the MNCs operate everywhere, where they can use the excuse that the subcontractors operate in other jurisdictions. Why do we think, on my substantive, this raises legal protections for workers in developing countries? Well, in the status quo, what's the incentives of the people involved? For the MNCs, we think their incentives are to get the cheapest possible labour because a lack of domestic regulations or investigations, and they want a lack of domestic regulations or investigations to prevent human abuses so that they this domestic cheapest possible labour. What does this mean? It means developing countries' incentives who want FDI and want the MNCs to come into their countries have incentives to have as low regulation as possible so Starbucks can come in and pay their workers pittance. And often these incentives of wanting investment from countries abroad overweigh the weak or non-existent democratic mechanisms. How do the incentives change on our side? On our side panel, MNCs now want the assurance that human abuses won't occur along their supply chain, so they won't be prosecuted. So they start, instead to look for the countries where they can pay their workers nothing, they look for the countries where they're certain that they won't be prosecuted for human abuses that were committed there because the countries have rigid laws against them. That means developing countries who still want this FDI start to implement rigid laws. So they can say to Starbucks, look, you don't have to worry about operating here. We'll make sure you don't get prosecuted because we'll make sure that human rights abuses don't happen here. We think this means they implement country-wide laws which affects every worker in that country. Because when Malaysia puts in place a higher minimum wage and basic workplace conditions, this doesn't just affect the workers who are working for the MNCs, but these are permanent legal changes that affect all companies and workers within that country. Ultimately, their side have no way to deal with the abhorrent cases of human rights abuses we see across the world. We think it is wrong that your iPhone is made by a company who is happy to pay their workers nothing, who is happy to make dangerous machines. And we think we change that on our side. I urge you to propose.
All right, the House thanks that speaker for their speech and calls on the second speaker of the opposition, here.
If I may have just 10 seconds, please.
Sorry, sure, that's fine.
Could Syria please send their speaker order through the chat?
Yeah, we actually already did send it.
Yeah,
is it clear? Our first speaker is also our reply. Okay, so I'm ready to start. I'll just set my timer. So, just a second. Okay, so I guess I'm ready to start. My speech starts in 3, 2, 1. The reason why companies like H&M, Zara, and many other fast fashion companies choose supply chains in countries like China and Bangladesh and India is because the suppliers in those countries themselves are the ones that violate human rights, because the countries themselves don't have stricter enforcement, and because of the context of those countries, because things like a violation of human rights is more acceptable there. The reason why those violations don't happen in countries like England and America is because those things are not accepted there within the country, and because persecuting them is more difficult. Because the rules in countries like Bangladesh and China are definitely much more lax. We think that by blaming the MNCs, you are actually turning a blind eye to the real issue, and that is why we're so proud to oppose. What will I be doing in my speech? First of all, several pieces of rebuttal and refutation, and then I'll be moving on to my substantive. So, first of all, refutation. I want to start by engaging with their case, by engaging by the very plausibility of their own solution. They started by talking that you can raise lawsuits against the MNC. Look, my first speaker spent most of his speech telling you about the cultural problems, the cultural expectations, and the mentality of the people in those countries. However, they still insist that those people who are getting violated, whose rights are getting violated, will just go and decide to sue Starbucks. We spent most of our LO's speech telling you how people are expected to work for money and how women are not allowed to work. Why would they go and sue this company? Second of all, how will they even sue? Even if they decided that, yes, I decided that I want to go and sue Starbucks. How are they going to sue? They are workers who are getting paid minimum wage. Where will they get this money from to go and get a lawyer in order to sue a company like Starbucks or Primark? Side England have such a naive idea about the context of the issues in those countries. They totally ignore that we are not living in the European Union right here. We are living in countries, we are dealing with countries like Bangladesh and China. So where poverty is such a great issue. So how will they get the money to pay? They are not likely to do anything. You don't give them any incentive to actually work for it. While on our side, if the responsibility was mainly on the country itself, and if the government was stricter towards the rules of violations, then all supply chains would have to adhere to those rules, and we would have to adhere to those rules. Second of all, on their point of legitimacy, before I move on, I'll take your point.
How do we reduce the catastrophic abuses perpetrated by shell suppliers in Malaysia on your side?
Okay. Thank you for your question. First of all, that would happen if there were stricter enforcement of human rights rules in Malaysia itself. And other than blaming this company for this, if you blame the company and this company left its Malaysia, then companies within Malaysia, the supply chain, nothing changed within Malaysia itself. The supply chain is still abusing human rights. Second of all, they started by talking about how most countries signed in the UN that they want the MNCs to hold responsibility. Okay, we tell you that you tell us they signed to the UN. If that's true, then how come human rights abuses are still happening? You tell us that they signed to the UN, and this shows you that those countries are not, that signing to the UN and holding them responsible did not change anything for them. And now I'll be moving on to my argument. No, thank you. Now I'll be moving on to my argument. So my first speaker showed you how holding companies liable affect their reputation and thus their profit. I'll be extending on that, showing you how the detrimental effects of this on the country in which the abuses are happening. So let's review what LO told you. If I, as a multinational corporation, decided to work with a certain supplier in a country X, this supplier turned out not to pay minimum wage to its workers, the responsibility was handed over to me as a company. I am unlikely to actually pay more money to fix the supply chain. What am I more likely to do as a company? Because I am incentivized by money, I'm more likely to just go towards another country where there are no issues and just hand over my country to that other country. I'm just going to look for another supply chain. So I, as a company, don't have the incentive to actually pay that much money to fix issues in every single country that I have supply chains in. Now, but even if I stayed in this country and MNC was held, so what is going to happen to those countries that this MNC left? These supply chains are still going to be worked, but worked by the companies of this own country. So the issue persists on their side. Those humans who are working, their rights are still being violated by the companies from their own nation. No, thank you. No, thank you. The companies from their own nation are still violating their rights because this MNC could simply change its country of production, but the supply chain still exists. The issue still exists. They tell us that this will give the supply chain or an incentive to actually fix itself. However, this is definitely not guaranteed because there is no idea that this developed country doesn't have companies within itself that are likely to invest within this MNC. If this issue persists in this country, then there are definitely going to be companies within these countries that are likely to pay this supplier without it having to actually fix anything. So now I'm going to continue. So if this is going to actually affect the MNC's reputation as a company, thus decreasing its profit, that this is another incentive for the MNC to not stay in this country. No, thank you. It does not incentivize it to actually fix issues. It's going to incentivize it to actually move to another country. Now, what are they most going to probably what is the most probable case? The most probable case is they're going to search for another country to do this supply process. What does this do? My first speaker told you it is going to remove the availability of this certain product from the country in which the supply chain exists in, or it's going to drastically raise the prices of this product. Now imagine we're talking about a medicine company, for example. No, thank you. Imagine we're talking about a medicine. Oh, I'll take your point since I'm nearing protected time. I'll take your point.
Yes or no, is it acceptable for Apple to not know that there are suicide nets in their factories?
Okay, first of all, as I told you, it's not acceptable for them not to know if this factory was directly from Apple. However, we are telling you are dealing with suppliers in other countries. If Apple left the supplier, those suicide nets are not going to change within this country. So this is going to raise the price of this product in this particular company, and raises the price of production, which drastically affects the availability of the products for people in this country. Look, side proposition has to understand that MNCs want money. They are not going to pay more money for anything. They're simply going to change their place of supply. Tell them what you may. Tell them they are responsible. They just want money. They're not going to be incentivized by telling them that you are responsible for these people. They are going to incentivize, but what brings them most money? This is evidenced by the action of most most MNCs today. So they are going to look for cheaper ways, since that's why they seek countries like Bangladesh and India in the first place. That is why they seek their production to happen there, because it is cheaper. But if you fix the issues within those countries themselves, that is when you fix the true issue. To solve the issue, you have to fix the root of the problem. You cannot use the MNC as a scapegoat for this problem. Proud to oppose.
Just a quick note, my bandwidth, I'm getting warnings that my bandwidth is a bit low. So if during the next speech the camera goes off, don't worry. I've just turned off my camera, but I'm still listening and still judging. So to the future speakers, do not be deterred by that. Okay. Anyway, we thank that speaker for their speech and call on the third speaker from the proposition here.
Is this audio okay? Is everyone here? Can you hear me? Cool. Okay. Panel, side opposition actually stood up in this debate and asked you to believe that the reason that Shell supply factories in Malaysia have inadequate safety equipment is because the Malaysian government actively wanted workers to suffer, to face catastrophic harms and risks in their workplace, rather than that overly powerful Western MNCs looking for an environment in which they can cut costs, looking for an environment in which abuses go unpunished, and finding one in a weak, in a comparatively weaker state than the one where they are selling their products, sought to pursue active deregulation by lobbying those governments, by threatening to withdraw from those states, and by imposing on them a life of effective servitude through starvation wages. We think that is galling, we think that is nonsensical, and we stand against it from side opposition. Two questions then in this debate. Are MNCs liable for abuses committed in their supply chains? We tell you that they are. And do we reduce human rights abuses in these supply chains on our side of the house? We tell you that we do. Firstly, panel, I just want to remind you of the sophistication of the principle we received from Joe that received not one line of engagement in the previous two speeches. He told you firstly that in most cases, MNCs are well aware of the abuses that take place in their supply chains. Tim Shipman, funnily enough, didn't actually just miss the New York Times report on suicide nets in Apple factories, but knowing that, deliberately profit off those abuses and choose not to intervene where the salary of their chief financial operating officer alone could pay for an MNC supervisor in every single factory they take supplies from. But he was generous. He engaged with the best case scenario for opposition also. He said that even in instances where these MNCs are ignorant of abuses, the fact that they are profiting from them means that they have a moral obligation to return those profits to the people they took that money from through having starvation wages, and that by causing that deregulation in those countries through stimulating a race from the bottom, they should take on moral responsibility. Not a single line of rebuttal from Team Syria. What did they ask you then to believe instead, panel? They told you that MNCs are bound by the norms and laws of the countries that they're in, and therefore, no thank you, we should blame governments. Look, unlike side opposition, we don't actually imagine that Bangladeshi people are somehow innately more inclined to want to work for starvation wages, or innately more inclined to tolerate the loss of thousands of people in a factory collapse. Rather, we give you the far more plausible characterization that largely Western MNCs exploit the economic vulnerability of largely post-colonial states in order to lobby those governments through far worse regulation in those factories in order to cut their own costs. That looks like things like threatening to pull out of those countries if they say they will introduce a minimum wage or safety regulation. That looks like things like cozying up to elites within those governments. We say that at the point that MNCs generate these cultural norms, as Team Syria term them, they are morally culpable for them. And we also tell you that given we structurally cannot change these systems without forcing MNCs to put that pressure on governments, as we told you in Liberty's speech, to no response, we only get change on our side of the house. Panel, if you really believe that Bangladeshi people want to work for starvation wages, then perhaps you are voting with Team Syria. I think it's personally improbable, and I think you are much more likely to buy our characterization of the vast abuses that these companies perpetrate. Let's look then at this second question of whether we see a reduction in human rights abuses. Before we do that, I'll take a point of information if they have one. No?
Look, I think considering your analysis, if it is true, why do you think that MNCs, their headquarters in Canada, for example, they adhere to the rules and laws of the country, but they don't in Bangladesh? Don't you think that because they don't exist?
The Canadian government has a far greater level of power in its relationships with MNCs that operate within it than the Bangladeshi government has, right? They are much less reliant on those MNCs, but also note that those MNCs are large selling and putting their main operations into or the US, where if abuses occur, they are held liable. If in Amazon head offices, cleaners aren't being treated properly, then in Canada, they will be civilly prosecuted. What's happening under the status quo is because their supply chains are largely located in less developed countries with less robust legal systems, where those things can be overlooked. MNCs are able to exploit them. Hope that's clear. Let's look now at how we get a reduction of human rights abuses. In Joe's speech, we told you why prosecutions are likely to be successful when you see things like whistleblowers being more willing to come forward, Western lawyers and institutions having a direct financial incentive to take on these cases, and them taking place within judicial systems. We told you how this incentivized things like hiring non-abusive subcontractors in such a way that lowers the general level of abuse in these factories. We told you that MNCs have direct incentive to send people in to make sure that high human rights standards are being observed. And in Liberty speech, we told you how because of the very nature of the power relationship between MNCs and governments, once those MNCs start to demand those standards, those things become labour laws across that country, benefiting everyone within it. What engagement did this receive from Team Syria? They told you firstly that the economic cost of the possibility of MNCs withdrawing from these countries when the cost of manufacture increases with better human rights conditions is something that is harmful to the populations there. A few responses. Note firstly that it is still much cheaper for an MNC to operate in, say, Bangladesh than the USA, where living costs are largely lower and therefore minimum wages are likely to be lower. But note that doesn't mean that minimum wages can't or shouldn't be offered in those instances. Right? But also note how unresponsive this is to what Liberty brought you in our second speech, that when MNCs have an incentive to ensure that there are no abuses in their factories, it changes the kind of regulatory environments they look for in those countries, and therefore incentivizes places like Bangladesh, places like Malaysia, places like Thailand to increase the robustness of the regulation in order to signal that those MNCs are behaving appropriately. Then they tell us these companies produce lower quality and more expensive products, and this is bad for their workers. Note that these companies are largely not selling to their own workers. These are products that are largely being sold in places like the US and Canada, where we think, frankly, the marginal cost to consumers of maybe an additional 20p on your plastic bag is a pretty minimal harm for them to have to take on in order to prevent a child from losing their fingers in unsafe machinery. But also note how unclear the links were here. There is no reason to imagine that a factory which abuses its workers produces higher quality products. Then they told us some people in Bangladesh might not be willing to bring these prosecutions. Note this frankly offensive characterization when footage emerges from these factories every day with workers screaming for help, but also note that they didn't listen to Joe's mechanism. He told you that because we're able to offer prosecutions in civil courts and in international courts in the West, because there's an incentive for lawyers to want to claim those legal fees, because there's an incentive for institutions to want the prestige of those prosecutions, that is where they are most likely to take place. And therefore, whether or not Bangladeshi workers are specifically involved in those prosecutions doesn't really make a difference. The only thing that comes to them as a result of them is money in their pockets. Comparatively, their only mechanism for change was pressure on governments in the developed world. Note that this was uncomparative because it didn't deal with supply chains. It instead dealt with head offices, which we already have regulation against, but also was unresponsive to what Joe told you about how boycotts are so much better when they are framed in the context of lengthy legal cases. Incredibly proud to propose.
All right, we thank that speaker for their speech and call on the third speaker from the opposition, here.
Just a second, please. Can I be heard and seen? My speech starts in 3, 2, 1. For the other side of the house to throw many one-liner mechanisms throughout the whole debate is something very problematic. they had no clear mechanisms on how they will hold the companies and MNCs liable, nor what are the consequences of this. They just ignored national laws and international relations by having a shallow mechanism, which is applying their mechanism in some civil courts. But further, the comparative they are trying to apply is not what today's debate is about. So, i.e., we are not saying that if I was a taxi driver and I hit a child, I wouldn't take responsibility for it. I am saying that the headquarter and the head of the company I work in shouldn't be held responsible for this. So proud to oppose. In my speech, I'll be answering two crucial questions in which that arose in today's debate, in which I'll be circulating all the clashes that happened today. The first one is who should be held accountable, which side is more legitimate when talking about this, and who can have a better prosecution. But the second one is who preserve better human rights and resources in weak countries that were the main stakeholders in today's debate. So, on the first question, who should be held accountable in today's debate, and who has a better prosecution? So, they took us on two cases. The first one is in which the company knew about what was happening, and the second one in which they didn't know. And I'll be dealing with these both of these as well. So, firstly, on the assumption that the company knows, they told us over and over again that the company should know about something like, for example, what is happening, something like suicidal stuff happening in their companies. Firstly, we had no clear link. We saw no clear link of this happening within today's motion and debate. But secondly, we don't think that this is always what is happening. We don't think that this is always the case. It's not always like this. So we think that it's not legitimate to claim in the world, for example, that the headquarters of Uber in the USA should be held accountable if an Uber driver sexually harassed a woman in Lebanon. We don't see that how they are taking the assumption that MNCs would have to know about everything because they simply will read about that in national magazines. We don't think that this is enough. We think that this is a minor case where they know and be silent about it. But secondly, we think that MNCs are very big and cannot control everything happening under them. So we think that this is problematic. But even if, let's take them on their best, and let's assume that even if they know about everything, so let's assume that the MNC know that child labor was happening in a country like Syria. So what will happen? We heard no clear answer for what we told you about that national laws already allowed it. So if we were able to prove in a civil court in Syria that an MNC knew about it and knew about these child workers in Syria, when it is legal, when the law has nothing to say about it, when it is totally 100% acceptable in the society, we don't think how they are going to have change in this situation. They never told us how. But further, when they are giving starvation salaries, this is because laws in these countries allow it. This is because this is the minimum wage in these countries. So when we put pressure on governments, when we change the way the government works, when we force the government to raise the minimum wage for all companies, we can have a better outcome. But secondly, on the assumption that the companies they don't know, they said that they will file negligent suit, but firstly they never showed us how will this have an impact. So what if I file a negligent suit and prove it in the court? They never tell me how this will have an impact on getting someone's human rights or having change. But second, they said that companies are much bigger than so there is no national country that is going to hold the companies accountable. It seems that the problem persists on their side of the house, and they hadn't shown any different real change on the ground. But now, thirdly, under the idea of prosecution, they continuously said that they will be having better prosecutions because they will give whistleblowers an incentive to do so, and lawyers an incentive to take these cases. But a simple response for this: we don't think that whistleblowers will always do this when they know that their interest lies in this company being here. So if a whistleblower, for example, whistleblowed on on a company that is like violating some human rights, firstly, we don't think that this will have a change if it's illegal in this country. But secondly, we think that not all whistleblowers will have the incentive to do so, because they will also be losing if the country, if the company was shut down, or if the company withdraw from the country itself. But secondly, about lawyers, we can also we don't think that this is exclusive on their side of the house, because we can also incentivize lawyers on our side when we give them high-profile cases to file, so for example, to fight for human rights against the whole country and against the whole law, rather than minor cases that might lose. So we think that incentivizing lawyers is not exclusive for their side of the house. So we think that Western powerful companies want to go to weak want to go into weak environment and weak countries that they can, because they know that there in these countries they would not be prosecuted, because the country itself is exploited, because the country itself allow human abuse. So we don't think that the solution here is to shift responsibility towards the MNCs, but rather to put the responsibility and the pressure on the government to do actual change. So under this point, we prove that it's not legitimate to say that MNCs know everything happening under their situation. But secondly, we don't think that it's going to do any change. Before I move on to the second question, if you are, please.
Surely we are more likely to get better regulatory environments in these countries when MNCs, as we've explained, they now have a financial incentive to pressure governments for it, rather than relying on the pressure from the populations of those countries whose governments are currently allowing them to be abused.
Thank you. I will directly be clashing with this point under the second question, because I will be directly clashing with the idea that you wouldn't be having any change or any actual any significant change in your side of the house, because the incentive you're talking about is not true. Because and I will be dealing with this directly now. So into the second question: who preserves the better human rights and resources? To have better situation, and then had a huge jump. In conclusion, they said that all companies in this country will avoid human abuses. So firstly, we don't think that the country will have this huge incentive you are talking about to change stuff, and we directly clash with this in our second argument, in our second speech, which you didn't reply to. We told you that the company, if they did so, they might be losing, and they might be losing in terms of finances. So they wouldn't do that by their own. They wouldn't have the incentive to do that if they weren't forced to do this. But secondly, because the companies, as you said in your first speech, will always have the choice to withdraw from the country. They might not just simply leave the supply chain, leave this country, and go to another place. So they don't have a direct incentive. And this hurt, this caused a lot of harm on our side of the house. But secondly, on how we can preserve better human rights, because we told you that we can put pressure on the government itself to change the law. So we won't be only filing lawsuits against child labor under iPhone company. We will be doing that under the whole companies in the country. That's why we can preserve better human rights, because we prove that it's not legitimate to hold them accountable, and you can have a more stable situation with both opposition.
All right, we thank that speaker for their speech and call on the opposition reply speaker to close the opposition case.
Maybe hear that I spoke this way. Great. So I'll start my timer in 3, 2, 1. If MNCs are worth billions, then all the cultural differences would go, and Zara would finally have zero inequality, zero child labor. Jeff Bezos would finally be a perfect man with none of these human rights abuses in these countries that we prove to you are proportionate. This is the rhetoric Team England brought to us in today's debate, which only demonstrates a lack of characterization. I'm going to be comparing our proposition world and opposition world in today's debate. So proposition, from the beginning, they brought to us this shallow model that they said they're going to find these companies proportionate to these human rights abuses. And secondly, no idea what these intergovernmental organizations are really about. And actually, this is literally their model that they repeated like 100 times that we didn't respond to. In opposition, we told you that yes, all right, go with this model, but they agreed with us that there will be losses. And then their third speaker, oh no, there will be no losses, although it was proved by Alm's speech. This would actually make MNCs less likely to have an incentive, as we proved to you, because if less profit, they care about profit at the end of the day, they have zero incentive to accept this pressure. They talk to us about incentive, they offer zero incentive. In opposition, we told you these cultural issues that exist in these societies, like being forced to work as a child, not forced, but this is what your parent expects from you. Actually, this is a majority of cases. And then they say on proposition, no, this is not a necessity to work. MNCs should just not do this in the first place. On opposition, we also had a clear response to this regarding the income of living for these people, that they use this opportunity even though it has hardships. The majority of cases do agree with us. Now, we were clear about it that it doesn't never happen in Canada. And their third speaker response to this is that, oh yes, quarters are based in these low-income, like Malaysia, low-income cities, with less laws. Yes, exactly, that is the point, panel, because there are less laws, these headquarters are based there. We didn't tell you that MNCs are perfect. We just told you they're not in a place to change these things, and they would lose profit otherwise. They told you also on the side of the house a very lack of solution. In their first speech, they only said the only thing that is incentive by MNCs that they actually give us no real pressure on these MNCs. We had two responses to this on our side of the house. Firstly, these laws are not allowing them, like in Libya, like in Northern Africa, literally no response to this. We give you the impact of this, that there's zero incentive. Secondly, they are less likely to know about these things that happen in these companies for whistleblowers, that they wouldn't jeopardize. They're still like these whistleblowers are less incentivized to whistleblow this information. Also, in opposition, we gave you a very important analysis. That is to say that the government laws are giving these children, more likely giving these children employment opportunities if they were to say that child labor is not good. We give you a real solution. But secondly, even if we do not give you anything, we give you at least a real decision makers that you can raise questions about. On proposition, the only response to this is that, oh, these countries signed the UN. And they actually legitimize these countries like Bangladesh to not enforce real laws. On their side of the house, they do not claim they're real stakeholders. In opposition, we told you, well, why Canada adheres and why Sudan does not adhere? This is an important question because look, rules and laws are the reason this is a legitimate action. We told you about the gender gap, that these people are not allowed to work. That's women in southern India. And even that if they work, these MNCs would not be able to cut labor for male. No response from their side of the house. On our side, we also told you that these MNCs all adhere from now on. We give you a sustainable impact because all MNCs will adhere. Notice that we do not have to give you a real solution, but at least we're not obliged to this, but at least we give you the real decision makers that we can raise questions. We did not say that MNCs are perfect. Laws and incentives by the child workers, by these families, by the cultural differences is the problem. They fail to exactly characterize these problems. On their side of the house, these women still are unemployed. These children are out of jobs. On our side of the house, at least, we pressure the right stakeholders, we pressure governments for a more likely approach. I beg you to oppose.
All right, I think that's and call on the proposition.
Can everyone hear me? Great. In their world, opposition stood by a failed status quo, where companies use faulty machines and pay their staff starvation wages. They decided to push change through governments rather than go after the MNCs who lobbied for those laws that the governments instituted. We stand by our world on proposition. We gave you clear mechanisms to improve and hold to account companies who perpetuate human rights abuses. 2 points of clash. Firstly, should these companies be liable? Secondly, which side more effectively reduces human rights abuses? On the first one, we were very clear from our Prime Minister's speech. Companies have caused these human rights abuses and they are liable. We gave you 5 reasons for that. What responses do we get? We hear firstly that it's a cultural problem. We told you it's a cultural problem caused by MNCs. That child labour happens when your father isn't paid enough for work by those MNCs, so you feel you have to work as well. They ignored the worst cases as well, where this is not cultural problems, this is faulty machines, this is collapsing factories. They told us about contractual obligations. Rachel pointed out how ridiculous this is. The idea that Bangladeshi workers and the Bangladeshi government wants to be paid less. It was ridiculous, it didn't stand. Thirdly, we heard that they can't control everything beneath them. We hear this in the third speech. We were very clear right from the beginning of our case, the reasons why if you do not notice it, that is negligence, that is not good enough. What were those 5 reasons? Firstly, they pay, fund and facilitate this abuse. Secondly, that they have huge power and financial capital to intervene. Thirdly, that it is negligent not to pay attention to them. Fourthly, they should return what they took. And fifthly, they caused this. On a principle ground, they simply didn't give us enough engagement. And we tell you very clearly, if companies are guilty of human rights abuses, they should face prosecution. That principle stands regardless of the impact. We win that, so we win the debate from side proposition. But secondly, on decreasing human rights abuses, we told you 3 crucial things. We told you we get successful prosecution. We told you how that changes MNCs. We told you how this changes their country. They answered this with a number of questions. They asked us how we would prosecute these people. We told you we would get top lawyers in who can claim legal fees. The whistleblowers would have a concrete interest in doing this. The institutions like the EU would do this, and on a 50-50 civil court split, they would have the evidence to do this. They asked why would people want to sue? We told you they would have a financial incentive, they would get help if they sued. They asked why they wouldn't move abroad. We told you clearly, there is an international jurisdiction. You cannot keep going around treading on countries abusing their human rights. They asked us how we changed norms. Liberty told you very clearly how MNCs lobby to improve regulation and change the norms of these countries. Every question they asked of our case, we answered with multiple reasons. It's clear our mechanisms stand. It's clear that we win the debate. But let's compare those mechanisms. They say national laws. They say pressure. And we told you these happen even more under our side. And we showed you why they're failing at the moment. The country simply cannot compete with the huge resources of MNCs that maybe top lawyers from the US can. We told you how we get more international attention, how we get more changes in laws, how MNCs start to actively lobby to change what is going on there. We showed you how we changed the incentives of key actors, of institutions, of lawyers, of multinational corporations. But when they conceded that costs were raised under our side, they conceded that we actually got changed. And we were happy to raise the costs of jeans, of iPhones, not the medical supplies. They conceded that we reduce human rights abuses because people are paid more. We were happy for people in the West to pay a bit more for the things they get. We were happy to deal with human rights abuses. We are very happy to stand on side proposition.
All right, thank you, everyone. I'm now going to let the Orcom know that we're done and try to get the judges moved out to a deliberation room. I encourage all the debaters to take this time to get to know your opposition, have some chats, and try and get some of the socializing that you would have got in an in-person tournament.
Hello, Kate. We got you on the Orcom. We'll send you to your own room in a moment. Thank you.
Okay, do I not need to message?
No, that's